The chandeliers sparkled like falling stars, their light scattering across a ballroom dripping in luxury. Crystal glasses clinked softly as the city's elite leaned in close, whispering behind manicured hands. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of love. At least that's what the invitations had promised. But beneath the silk gowns and polished tuxedos, the air carried something else, mockery dressed as curiosity. At the center of it all stood the groom, a young millionaire with the kind of confidence only wealth could purchase. His tailored suit fit like armor, his smile rehearsed, and yet, it wasn't joy lighting his face. It was something darker. A smirk tugged at his lips as he exchanged knowing glances with a small circle of friends tucked away in the corner. Their stifled laughter echoed like poison. For them this wasn't romance. It was sport. And then there was the bride. She entered quietly, almost swallowed by the grandeur of the hall. A poor woman, heavy-set, her gown simple against the backdrop of extravagance. The lace sleeves stretched slightly over her arms, the hem not quite cut to perfection. But none of that mattered. She carried herself with a dignity that seemed to rise above the whispers slicing through the room. Her hands trembled only slightly as she clutched her bouquet, her eyes refusing to drop to the floor. The guests didn't see her courage. They only saw what they wanted to see, her size, her plainness, the fact that she did not belong to their world of diamonds and estates. Why her? Someone hissed beneath the music. Is he mad? Another scoffed. They couldn't imagine that love could bloom here, and they were right. Because this was no love story. Not yet. The groom's smirk widened as he glanced at his friends once more. They nodded back, satisfied. This was the payoff to a cruel game, a bet made in shadows and carried into daylight without shame. To him she wasn't a partner. She was proof. Proof that money could buy anything, even a wedding vow. And yet, even as she walked toward him, something unsettled the air. Maybe it was the way she straightened her shoulders despite the daggers in every gaze. Maybe it was the way her chin tilted upward, not in arrogance but in quiet defiance. Or maybe it was the unspoken truth that hovered between them, that this story was only beginning, and its ending would belong to her. The music swelled, the vows prepared, the whispers sharpened. Everyone thought they knew exactly how this tale would unfold, a rich man's joke at a poor woman's expense. But stories have a way of turning against their authors. And as her trembling hands finally rested in his, the question no one dared ask hung heavy in the air. What happens when a bet collides with a woman who refuses to break? From the day he was born, the millionaire never once tasted the sting of no. His childhood was carved out in estates with endless corridors, private tutors, and servants who rushed at the snap of his fingers. While other boys scraped knees on playgrounds, he was chauffeured in sleek black cars. He grew up believing the world bent easily to his will. And often it did. By the time he reached his late 20s, wealth wasn't just something he possessed, it was the air he breathed. Business deals fell in his lap, parties in his honor stretched into dawn, and his circle of friends, equally entitled, treated life as a board game where people were nothing more than pawns. One evening, while sipping champagne in a penthouse lounge with the city glittering beneath them, the conversation turned to women. They spoke not of love or partnership, but conquest. Who could charm the most, control the most, discard the most. And then, as arrogance does, the conversation shifted into cruelty. One friend leaned forward with a smirk. You, of all people, could make even the most undesirable woman your trophy. Prove it. The others laughed, clinking glasses. It was not said as a challenge but as bait, the kind that his pride could never refuse. To them this was entertainment. To him it was a chance to demonstrate his power. And so the bet was struck. Weeks later he chose her. The woman they mocked was not a stranger to cruelty. From childhood she had been laughed at for her weight, dismissed by teachers who assumed quietness meant weakness, and underestimated at every turn. But though her world was small, tiny apartments, long bus rides to work, second-hand clothes, her heart was not. She devoured books in libraries when she couldn't afford classes. She worked 2 jobs to care for her aging mother. She had learned to walk through jeers with her head held high. And when he appeared in her life, polished and charming, she didn't see the trap behind his smile. She saw a chance at something she had almost given up on, being chosen, being wanted. For once she let herself believe. The wedding, as grand as it was, marked the beginning of a cold and hollow married life. In the mansion's marble halls she was little more than a shadow. He barely spoke to her except in front of others, where his words dripped with condescension disguised as banter. Every gesture, pulling her chair too harshly, sighing loudly when she spoke, was designed to amuse his friends and remind her of her place. And yet she did not lash out. At dinners, when laughter rose at her expense, she smiled faintly and folded her napkin. When his friends ignored her presence, she asked the servants about their families, remembering their names, their worries, their joys. In silence she built bridges where he burned them. The cruelty was sharp, but her quiet strength sharper still. There were nights when she sat alone in the vast bedroom, her reflection caught in the gilt mirrors. She traced the lines of her face, the curve of her body, and whispered the words her mother had once told her. Worth is not written in glass or gold or whispers. Worth lives here. She pressed her hand against her chest and breathed, steadying herself for another day. He meanwhile treated the marriage as a performance. When his friends visited, he paraded her like proof of his victory. When they left, he retreated to his study, leaving her alone with only the ticking of antique clocks for company. He thought he was winning the bet. But the truth was, something else was happening. Something none of them saw. Because while he played games with cruelty, she revealed grace in ways he could not ignore. Her patience, her compassion, her refusal to crumble. These were not the marks of weakness. They were the marks of power. And though the audience of this story may already feel the anger of his arrogance, they cannot help but also feel the weight of her resilience. It is this tension, the cruelty of privilege clashing with the quiet dignity of humility, that sets the stage for everything that follows. The stage is set. The battle lines are drawn. But the war ahead will not be fought with money or wagers or pride. It will be fought with character. The marriage may have begun as a cruel wager, but life had its own way of testing the heart. In the weeks that followed, the cracks began to show, not in her but in him. At every dinner party, the stage was set for mockery. His friends, emboldened by fine wine and each other's cruelty, took turns sharpening their words into daggers. They teased her weight, her clothes, her background. "Tell us," one smirked across the table, "what fork do you use when the meal isn't served in a paper box?" The room erupted in laughter. He leaned back in his chair, pretending indifference, but his eyes flicked toward her. And then something happened he did not expect. She didn't shrink. She didn't snap. She smiled politely, lifted the correct fork with calm precision, and answered, the same fork one uses to remind themselves that kindness always tastes better than mockery. The table fell quiet, and for a flicker of a moment, admiration replaced laughter. She had turned their cruelty into shame without raising her voice. This became a pattern. At gatherings where she should have crumbled, she instead disarmed cruelty with humility, wit, and dignity. Outsiders who had come expecting scandal began to whisper something different. "She has grace," they murmured. "She's not what they say." Still, inside the mansion's walls, she remained unseen, at least by him. Or so he thought. Because while he continued to perform his cold charade, she lived differently. She spoke to the staff as equals, remembering names, birthdays, and family struggles. When a maid's child fell ill, she slipped money into her hand without a word. When the gardener limped from a fall, she wrapped his ankle herself, telling him to rest while she watered the flowers. One afternoon, he returned unexpectedly and found her in the kitchen, apron on, laughing with the cooks as she kneaded dough with clumsy but joyful hands. The scene startled him. It was the first time he had seen her laugh, not forced, not polite, but real. For a second, the sound unsettled him. It was too pure, too alive, in a house that felt otherwise hollow. Something stirred inside him. Confusion, perhaps. Or guilt. He told himself it was nothing and walked away. But the image stayed. The more he noticed, the harder it became to dismiss. She never retaliated when mocked. She never sought pity. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet strength that demanded respect without asking for it. She was not bitter, though life had given her every reason to be. She was not vengeful, though cruelty hovered at every corner. She radiated something foreign to him, grace. And that grace began to work on him like water against stone. Yet with admiration came conflict. Around his friends, he still played the part of the superior, making sure his smirk never faded. To do otherwise would be to admit weakness, to lose the bet, to lose face. But in the quiet of the night, he lay awake replaying the moments when her words silenced cruelty, when her kindness lifted others, when her laughter filled spaces he didn't know were empty. It unsettled him. For the first time in his life he felt ashamed, not of her but of himself. One evening, after another dinner filled with sly remarks, he lingered in the hallway, watching her as she removed her jewelry in front of the mirror. Her shoulders slumped, her smile fading once she thought no one was looking. In her eyes he caught a glimpse of exhaustion, of wounds deeper than words. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Mama always said, strength isn't in fighting back. It's in staying kind when the world teaches you to be cruel." He froze. Her words unlocked something in him, a memory of her past that she carried silently. For her, cruelty wasn't new. As a child, she had endured the jeers of classmates, the sting of being left out, the labels written on her body before she could write her own story. She had come home in tears only for her mother to sit her down and remind her, "The world will try to make you small. Don't let it. Humility is not weakness. Kindness is not surrender. They are your strength." Those lessons had shaped her, hardened her spirit without hardening her heart. And now, in this mansion where she was meant to be broken, she stood tall because of them. The millionaire didn't know all of this yet, but he could sense it, like a secret hidden beneath the surface of her calm. Something about her past had forged a strength he couldn't yet explain. And so the second gap appeared. For all his wealth, for all his arrogance, he realized he didn't truly know the woman he had married. He had mocked her, underestimated her, even used her as a wager. But now, a question gnawed at him, one he dared not say aloud. Who really is she? The grand gala was meant to dazzle. Gold-trimmed invitations had promised an evening of elegance, and the ballroom did not disappoint. Crystal chandeliers cast diamond light over polished marble, a string quartet filled the air with melody, and guests swirled in gowns and tuxedos that cost more than some people's homes. Yet beneath the splendor, something venomous stirred. She arrived wearing a simple navy dress. It wasn't designer, nor was it stitched by a famous tailor. But its clean lines and modest shimmer gave her a glow that needed no brand label. In a room bursting with sequins and diamonds, her quiet choice made her stand out in the most unexpected way. And while the guests whispered about her body, her background, her supposed unworthiness, she walked with her chin lifted, the faintest smile softening her face. But his friends, the ones who had started it all, were restless. The bet, once whispered over champagne, felt too delicious to keep hidden. Their laughter, already cruel in private, sharpened in public. One leaned across the table, voice dripping with malice. "Tell us, how does it feel to be the prize in a game?" Another chuckled, adding, "Careful now, you might let the secret slip." The words struck like arrows and she caught them all. At first she thought she had misheard. But then she saw the sideways glances, the smirks, the way his friends elbowed each other with cruel delight. Her heart lurched. A bet. A cruel game. That was what this marriage had been. For a moment the air seemed to vanish. She felt the sting of betrayal wrap around her chest, squeezing tight. The room tilted. She could have collapsed, could have fled in tears. That was what they wanted, to see her broken, humiliated, small. But instead she straightened her back. Her hands smoothed the fabric of her simple dress. She lifted her chin, and when she spoke, her voice carried not with anger, but with clarity, calm, steady, and piercing enough to silence the music itself. "You laugh because you believe wealth gives you power. You whisper because you think cruelty makes you clever. But tell me, what does it say about you that you needed a bet to prove your worth?" The words cut deeper than any insult could. A hush fell over the crowd. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at one another with shame. The laughter of his friends died on their lips, frozen mid-smirk. For the first time their game was not entertainment, it was exposure. She turned to the room, her gaze sweeping across the sea of jewels and polished shoes. "You judge me for my size, for my background, for not belonging to this world of chandeliers and champagne. But character is not stitched into gowns or measured by a waistline. It is revealed in how we treat others. And tonight, I think we've all seen whose character shines and whose does not." Her words hung in the air like a verdict. The silence that followed was deafening. Some guests bowed their heads. Others averted their eyes. A few even nodded, quietly admiring the courage it took to stand tall where so many would have crumbled. And him, the millionaire groom, he sat frozen. Shame washed over him, heavy and suffocating. In that instant he saw everything laid bare. His arrogance, his pride, the cruelty he had embraced. The bet had been his doing, his performance, his poison. And yet, here she was, radiating a strength he had never known, disarming his world with nothing more than dignity. It was the first time in his life that he truly felt small. For the first time he admired her, not as a pawn in a cruel game, not as an object of ridicule, but as a woman whose presence shifted the very ground beneath him. Her strength was not in wealth, nor appearance, nor status. It was in her refusal to bend to cruelty, her ability to rise when others tried to drag her down. In that moment something cracked within him. The mask of arrogance he had worn so long began to slip. The friends who had laughed now shifted uncomfortably, their smugness unraveling under the gaze of a crowd that no longer cheered them on. And beside them, the millionaire finally looked at his bride, not as a bet, but as the only person in the room who had told the truth. And in that truth he saw something else, a woman he could fall in love with. She turned away, her expression calm, her simple navy dress catching the chandelier's light just enough to make her glow. She didn't need jewels to shine. She was the gem. That night the power shifted. The bet, once his weapon, had become his shame. Her dignity, once their target, had become her crown. And though the evening ended with music resuming and conversations forced back into motion, nothing was the same. The whispers were no longer about her size or her background. They were about her words, her courage, her poise. The millionaire, sitting silently beside her, felt something new take root in his chest, something unfamiliar and humbling. For the first time he realized he was not the strongest person in the room. She was. And for the first time he wanted not to win a bet but to win her heart. For a fleeting moment, it seemed change was possible. The gala had shifted something, the whispers no longer ridiculed her, and his heart, once sealed by arrogance, had cracked open. But cruelty rarely dies quietly. The very next week, a headline blazed across glossy magazines and online tabloids. Millionaire's marriage was just a bet. The story spread like wildfire. Reporters quoted unnamed friends close to the groom, relishing every sordid detail. Photographs of the wedding splashed across front pages, framed not as a union but as a cruel joke. Talk shows debated it. Social media exploded. Some mocked her appearance, others pitied her. But to her, none of that stung as much as the betrayal, the knowledge that the man who had vowed to protect her had once reduced her to a wager. She retreated from the world. Curtains drawn, phone silenced, she hid from the storm. Not because of her size. Not because of cruel words. She had lived with those all her life. No, this wound cut deeper. It was betrayal, the breaking of trust she had allowed herself to give. Meanwhile, the millionaire sat in the hollow quiet of his mansion, headlines staring back at him from every glowing screen. His friends laughed it off, sending him messages, "Don't worry, she'll get over it. Just play it cool." But for the first time their voices rang hollow. He looked at her empty chair across the dining table and felt the weight of choice pressing down on him. Would he stay silent, protect his pride, and let the world believe the marriage was nothing but a cruel stunt? That would keep his image intact. His friends would stay close. His reputation as untouchable would remain. Or would he step into the fire? Would he face the world and admit his shame? Would he stand beside the woman he had wronged and defend her, not as a pawn in a game, but as his wife, as the only person who had ever shown him what true strength looked like? The world waited. She waited. And he was left staring at the crossroads where his pride and his heart collided. What he chose next would define not just their marriage but the man he would become. The dining room glittered with the same extravagance as always, long mahogany table, silverware polished to a shine, wine poured into crystal glasses. But tonight the atmosphere was different. There was no laughter, no careless arrogance. Instead there was tension thick enough to choke on. The millionaire had summoned them, his so-called friends, the very men who had pushed him into cruelty and betrayal. They came expecting excuses, maybe even another round of laughter at her expense. What they found was something else entirely. He stood at the head of the table, shoulders heavy but unflinching. She sat quietly at his side, her presence calm, her eyes wary. She hadn't forgiven him yet. Not fully. But she was here, waiting to see if he would finally choose. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual charm. It was raw, unpolished, almost foreign to him. "I need to say something," he began, the room falling silent. "What happened, the bet, the whispers, the humiliation, it was mine. My arrogance. My shame. And for it I have no defense." A murmur rippled through the group. One friend smirked, waving his hand. "Oh, come on, it was just a game." "No," he cut in sharply. His voice trembled, but not with fear, with conviction. "It wasn't a game. It was cruelty. And I let it poison not only myself but the one person who has shown me what worth really means." All eyes shifted to her. She didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper, the written proof of the bet, signed and smugly kept as if it were a trophy. His hands shook as he opened it, glanced at it one last time, and then tore it slowly, deliberately into pieces. The scraps fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. Gasps echoed around the table. One man laughed nervously, trying to lighten the air. "Really? You're choosing her over everything we built?" He turned to his so-called friends, his eyes hard. "Everything we built was nothing but sand. She," he gestured to his wife, voice cracking, "is the only one who's ever stood in this room with true dignity. You mocked her, I mocked her, and yet she never once lowered herself to our level. That is strength. That is worth." And if I have to lose everything else to stand beside her, then so be it. For the first time, silence truly claimed the table. Some looked ashamed. Others looked away. A few still smirked, but no one dared speak against him, because deep down they knew he was right. She sat still, her hands folded in her lap. His words were a beginning, not an ending. Betrayal could not be erased in a single speech, nor trust rebuilt overnight. But when she finally looked up, there was something in her gaze, not full forgiveness, but the quiet grace of someone willing to see if change could be real. And in that moment the power flipped. The woman they once mocked as a joke, as a pawn, as undesirable, had become the moral center of the story. The millionaire may have had the money, but she had the strength. And for the first time he bowed, silently, humbly, not to wealth, not to pride, but to her. Time has a way of revealing truth. What began as a cruel wager slowly transformed into something no one, not even he, could have predicted. Their marriage, once hollow and built on lies, grew into a partnership anchored in respect. For the millionaire the journey was not easy. Pride is heavy, and arrogance does not loosen its grip overnight. But he began to change in small ways. He listened more and spoke less. He noticed the people who once faded into the background, the drivers, the cooks, the staff he had treated as invisible. And he began to see them through her eyes, with dignity and humanity. He no longer cared to impress the friends who once fed his ego. One by one they drifted away, unable to recognize the man who had stepped out of their shallow games. And for the first time in his life he didn't mind being alone. Because he wasn't alone. He had her. And she, though scarred by betrayal, chose to let forgiveness guide her more than anger. Forgiveness did not erase what he had done, but it gave them a chance to rebuild something new. Together they carved out a life not measured in bets or wealth, but in quiet evenings, shared laughter, and the kind of respect that can only be earned. In the end, the story was never about a bet, or about a marriage that began in cruelty. It was about transformation, his, yes, but also hers. Because even when the world tried to reduce her to a joke, she never let them define her worth. She carried herself with grace when others offered mockery, with humility when others offered arrogance, with strength when others expected weakness. And that became the greatest lesson of all. True beauty is not found in appearances. True worth is not bought with wealth. It lives in character, in resilience, in the ability to stay kind when the world is cruel. As he once told her, in a moment of rare honesty, you were never the bet. You were always the prize. And for the first time in his life he meant it.